All right, welcome everybody here to Vikings, Norse mythology, and pop culture, and the online folks as well. So, people in the room, there's going to be a Q&A section I have at the end of every one of these presentations, so just hold your questions till the end, and I think we'll have plenty of time, because presentations maybe about 45 minutes, and then we can dig into your favorite topics on Norse myths and anything you might not know that you want me to dig into for you. So the really interesting thing is when we ended up getting into doing this commercially, because our RPG is actually 30 years old, turned 30 last year, came out in '93, but it wasn't really a commercial venture for us. It was more like a hobby between us and our friends of friends. But since 2012, when we took a go at making this a commercial venture and see, will this actually stick? Vikings have become really popular. So for the last 10 years, we've been writing a very fun way for all of our product lines. So when we look at TV shows, there's Almighty Johnson's from Australia, a whole series of Marvel movies that deal with Asgard, Loki, and Ragnarok. Loki got his own spin-off as well. The Vikings TV show, which was monumentally successful and has a couple of spin-offs that are planned for it, and The Last Kingdom as well, and so many more probably popping into your heads. But that's not all. I mean, it's been trending also in literature. So when we look at, literature and video games. Magnus Chase, my son started reading that whole series about, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, and, they do a good job doing the research and applying it to kids' books. Then when we look at video games, there's Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is on the slide, God of War, the Banner Saga, Senua's Sacrifice. A lot of really cool games that are like jumping on the bandwagon of Norse mythology right now, because more and more, I guess, their development teams are getting immersed in other mediums, reading it in novels, watching it in movies, and they want to bring it to the video game screens. And then when we look at tabletop and graphic novels, we've got like Blood Rage, which is a buddy of mine signed about 10 years ago. Then we've got our RPG Fate of the Norns Ragnarok. There's a whole bunch more RPGs that are out there that are also steam on Norse myths. And then graphic novels. So we've got the Northlanders series of graphic novels that inspired us to make our own line of graphic novels, which we just started releasing as of last year. So we'll talk about that as well. So where does this all stem from? Where did everything begin? And it wasn't 10 years ago, I can assure you that. We can go way back to Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, who was very fluent in Old Norse. He did his own translations of some of those old manuscripts into English. And then if we go even further back, we have Wagnerian operas, the Rheingold and the Valkyrie. Even further back, we've got Bill Shakespeare, who had Hamlet and other inspired works. And then we get back to the Nibelung Guide, which is, I don't know why we've got some trimming issues on the screen, but what's on the slides? All right, so the Nibelung Guide, which is a book that was written in the 13th century, and this was a retelling of the Volsung Saga, which was an oral tradition story from about 700, 800. Both stories were similar, but they have their differences because a lot of time did pass between those two books. So what are the sources? Like if you really want to go all the way back to the beginning, when did those oral traditions get put down on paper? Where could you get your hands on these original sources? And those would be broken down into three categories of books. So there's the Poetic Edda, which is a whole bunch of poetry that's written with kennings, which is a style of poetry that was really popular in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. The sagas, so Icelandic sagas are probably the most well known, but there's also Norwegian sagas, Danish sagas, Swedish sagas. And then we have the Prose Edda, which was written by Snorri Sturluson, which is basically a collection of, or a summary of a lot of the stuff that's happening in the Poetic Edda, along with some stories that are omitted from the Poetic Edda, what we call the Poetic Edda. So let's start with the mythology. So the Poetic Edda is pretty much the oldest set of works out there. The Poetic Edda, we don't know most of who the authors are. They're all anonymous, so they were all translated later and put down on paper by missionaries in Iceland. And this covers a really wide range of things, from the creation myths all the way to the gods, the Jotuns, the hijinks between both tribes, moral and incredible heroes like Sigurd, slaying the dragon Fafnir, the end of the world at Ragnarok, magical swords and spears, incredible locations, incredible magical items, and the stories behind the forging of those magical items. So when you look at your high fantasy TTRPGs that have crafting mechanics and forging mechanics, most of that is directly inspired from these sources. Now, all of these works are preserved and digitized in various academic locations, so I ended up using it for a lot of my research as well. The thing is, with the Poetic Edda, there are some poems that are in duplicate and have contradictions in them. So like any mythology, it's going to be messy. You're going to end up seeing some things that are omitted as well. So like this story of Kara the Valkyrie, there's only parts 1 and 2, and we don't know what part 3 is, because that has not surfaced to date yet. And then we'll move on to the Prose Edda. So as I mentioned earlier, this was written by Snorri Sturluson, who was a law speaker in Iceland. And he broke this down into 4 different chapters. The first chapter was really to make sure that he does not get burned at the stake as a heretic. So it's a complete disclaimer. It doesn't really get into any of the myths or anything. He just says, hey, I'm about to talk to you about all kinds of really cool Norse gods and giants and everything, but really they were heroes that came from Troy, and then they're carving out very successful kingdoms, centuries ago in our lands. And so, people thought of them as gods. And so this way, it's like, okay, disclaimer's done. Now he launches into the Viking, which is the chronological story about the gods and their adventures. So you end up dealing with creation myths, the Aesir Vanir War. So Aesir are the newer gods that you all are familiar from Marvel movies and things like that, Thor, Odin, Tyr, Heimdall. But then you have the Vanir gods, which are the old gods, which are Njord, Gretchen, Frey, Freya, Aegir. So those are the ones that are kind of now getting overshadowed during the Viking Age. So those are the proto-Viking gods. Now you've got another generation of gods that are coming into play. The Skaldskaparmal, which is an explanation of how kennings work. So when you start reading a lot of these poems yourself in Old Norse, they're very musical. They have a nice rhyme to them and a rhythm to them. But they also talk to you about things like a sword would be called a shield biter. So they'd have all kinds of kennings for different types of activities, actions, nouns, verbs, things like that. And so without kind of understanding how to decipher these, you could be lost trying to read some of these poems. So this chapter basically ends up talking about the whole structure behind it and how you go about interpreting them. And then the Hadatal is more rules that Snorri adds and some of his own poems as well. So this is a great place to start. This is what I would recommend if you really want to go back to the old sources. This is much more accessible than the Poetic Edda. It reads much clearer and has like a clear beginning, middle, and end to the story, whereas the Poetic Edda is all over the place in terms of there's no set chronology. It's just a bunch of poems strapped together. And if you buy a book with the Poetic Eddas in them, no 2 books I think are going to have the same chapters in the same ordering. All right, so now let's talk about the history. Talk a little bit of mythology. Now let's dive into the Viking Age. So the very first book that I would recommend that I went to when I was looking at kings and queens and wars and battles and heroes and stories is the Heimskringla, which translates to the Chronicle of Kings. This book basically starts out with monarchs from 700, 800. Really spends a lot of time on King Harald Fairhair because he was the first king to unify all of the petty kingdoms, including the first big kingdom of Norway. And that goes all the way to Harald Hardrada in 1066. Then we talk about Norse sagas. And Norse sagas can be broken down into several categories. There are historical Norse sagas, there's mythic Norse sagas, and there are quasi-mythic or quasi-historical Norse sagas. So the Norse sagas that are historical would be the ones that have other literature that will validate that this king so-and-so is alive, his exploits were this and that, X, Y, and Z. And so we know that there are multiple sources, and he's not, holding his breath for 20 minutes underwater fighting trolls. He's not leaping over mountains and leading, armies by himself. The mythic ones, you'll see all of the above that I just mentioned. So you're going to have, the most brilliant of all warriors, and then the most charismatic of all warriors, and the most, it's always, tons of platitude, fun platitude. That, you read the next story with the next guy that is the most brilliant, and then you're like, how do I compare these two? They were both, the cream of the crop. So There was a lot of Norse sagas to look at, but we're going to get to Icelandic sagas, which would be the ones that I would recommend if you're going to start somewhere. Beowulf. Some of you might have a little bit of PTSD from high school having to read this in Old English. So unless this is really close to your heart, you love this kind of stuff, some of these reads can be a complete slog. And so Beowulf tells a story of a chieftain whose kingdoms are beset by trolls. He hires a young warrior to go and deal with the troll, and this is very much not a historical saga. The king is a historical figure, but the whole saga goes really into the metaphysical and the supernatural. Then we got the Gesta de Nora, which is the history of the Danes. And this was written by Saxo Grammaticus around the 12th century. And this deals with the Danish ruling families throughout the Viking period. But it also deals with Norway, Sweden, and you can tell it's highly editorialized, because when you end up looking at some of the stuff that they talk about the Norse, there's always like some sort of little twist to them. Oh, this guy was, had eyes for other women, was unfaithful to his wife, or this guy, he let his armies run ahead of him, and he was at his back. So there's a lot of editorialization that I found in it, which was very humorous to read, because you don't really see that in a lot of the literature. Is that kind of heavy editorialization to the point of being funny. And then we get to Icelandic sagas, which were written in 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. The two most famous ones are Njal Saga and Egil Saga. Njal Saga is cited as like the Odyssey of all of the literature when it comes down to Viking myths and sagas. So this would be the one that I would recommend that you guys would start with. It's a little bit on the long side, but it's a great tale. And the Icelandic sagas were really a byproduct of the exodus of everyone leaving Scandinavia around the time of King Harald Fairhair's death, because when he died, all of his kids started fighting for the throne, and he never left clear lines of succession. And he was a king that had many wives, highborn and lowborn kids everywhere. And so when everyone started fighting, then there was a lot of nobles and other folk that were just heading off across the sea to see what they could find more peaceful lands. And they did call it Iceland because they were like, don't come here. We got a good thing going. It's nice. It's terrible. We'll go to this other place further north called Greenland. It's going to be a lot better for you. All right. So now let's talk about how far these guys went in their travels around the world. And, obviously, 8th century, they're all hanging around Scandinavia, around the Baltic Sea, around the North Sea. Around the 9th century, there's some weather patterns that could be seen globally. So if you start looking at the history of the Celtic kingdoms, or even you can go as far as Japan. 9th, 10th century, there was some sort of global warming or mini ice age, called a mini ice age, that really failed a lot of crops. And so the 9th century begins the expansion. And 10th century, you have them going down looking for new trade routes. So they're heading down the Volga River at this point, going past Kiev. They started a new dynasty of kings in modern-day Ukraine, the Rurik dynasty. So this lasted for many, many centuries. And they went all the way down to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. And when they went down there, they went to a great city called Miklagard, which we know as Constantinople. And they impressed the emperor so much that he hired them as his personal bodyguard. And they were known as the Viking Guard. And there are sagas about the Viking Guard. And then they head further east. There are relics and artifacts that have been found as far as Iraq that have iconography that is Scandinavian. They definitely went to Greenland. There's the Greenland sagas that talk about their language barriers with the natives, trying to barter and trade with the natives, and battles ensuing with the natives. And then they obviously went down to Canada as well, because we have, I'm Canadian, we've got a province on the Atlantic seaboard called Newfoundland, and on the northern tip there's an archaeological site called Malston, and over there it's a whole series of Viking artifacts and a settlement there that was spent for a season. So they spent a winter there, and then they moved on elsewhere. And then I've got a really funny anecdote where I was flying down to PAC South in San Antonio, one of our conventions, and I was sitting next to a professor from the University of Mexico City. And we're chatting, and he finds out what I do, and then he goes, oh, let me tell you about this mural that we have down in Mexico. And in this mural, he goes, there's a whole bunch of North American tribes. And you can see they're all different, they're all coming from different regions in North America and probably even from Central America because of their headdress, the clothing, and everything. And in that mural, there's a short, red-haired white guy holding something completely alien and foreign in this mural. God damn it, Vikings were everywhere. All right, so let's talk about them as raiders and traders. They were not an insular society. They were very much outgoing. And these guys traveled far and wide and absorbed many other cultures. So when they looked at their polytheistic beliefs in terms of they believed in the Aesir gods, the Vanir gods, Landvetir, which are land spirits, the Alfar, which are elves that would live in the land, they would venerate. And so when they would run across other belief systems that had their own religions, like Christianity, they'd just go into Rolodex, put in Christ, and go, okay, so what's this guy good for? When do we pray to him and leave on him offerings? So they were very much open-minded in terms of other people's belief systems, and it was the same thing with their cultures. And they rubbed off on everyone that they interacted with as well, which makes it really, really interesting. And one of my theories as to why these guys are so popular even to this day. We're over 1,000 years past their heyday, and still they're inspiring our literature, our video games, our tabletop games, and definitely we can't overlook their badass reputation. So when you look at their culture was all about dying in battle gloriously. So they had a concept of, they didn't have heaven or hell, they didn't have like 7 deadly sins or 10 commandments, but they had, you will die in battle valorously, and that is what we're all aspiring to, because the Valkyries will come pick us up and bring us up to Valhalla, which is in English Valhalla, the Hall of Odin. And so it makes for very, very interesting role-playing and video games and things like that when you've got characters that are really going above and beyond, trying to stay alive in a battle. So now let's talk about the modern applications that we've seen with Norse mythology and culture. So one of the things that I see all the time, we do probably about 12 conventions a year around the world, and cosplay is one of the biggest ones. And they always, oh, Viking booth, and they all come by dressed as Valkyries or Loki or Thor, and some of them have amazing tattoos that we take photos of. We love to see it. So if you guys have like Viking ink by our booth, we'd love to see it, right? But yeah, so that's one of the things that's really, really picking up right now in terms of on the cosplay side. Now the Loki series, I think we see a whole lot more Lokis walking around. Liv is a Viking, so we've been familiar with Renaissance fairs, but now there's more and more different time period fairs that are popping up, including Viking Age fairs. And in these fairs, you end up having people dress the period. They cook with ingredients and recipes from that period. They build their buildings using no modern tools. They'll have like wooden pegs for nails instead, like an auger to make holes in wood. All hand tools. And they live there for sometimes a weekend, as short as a weekend or a day, or as long as a month. We have a place in Quebec called Vikiing, and it is an entire city that has been built. We're talking city blocks of ancient buildings. And people go there for like a month or two. The summer vacation is there, and everyone plays a character and things like that, which is really, really well to see. And then I mentioned Hema here, which is battles with metal weapons. So you've got foam weapons you can fight with, but there's another level you can take to where you're actually wearing armor and you can wield metal weapons, but unsharpened, obviously. And then we're looking at Viking religions. So a lot of the pagan religions are coming back as well. One of the most popular is the Satru. They've got over 5,000 members now in Iceland as of, the slide is up in 2023. So yeah, pretty accurate there. They use a lot of the teachings of Odin. So things like the Havamal. Havamal is one of the poems from the Poetic Edda, where Odin basically speaks of his own experiences and the best way to live. So what are the life lessons? We also have some really stupid stuff that has come out in modern day times, which is white supremacy, latching on to Viking or Norse iconography and the gods and the sagas, but they are completely out to lunch. So if you end up looking, what I was trying to explain to you is the Vikings were raiders, yes, but they were traders. They went after all other cultures. And then if you look at the gods, the Asgardians, right? They did not care who your lineage was. Most of them were actually mixed blood. They either had Jotuns or ASS blood, so it's Aesir blood or God blood. So most of them were mixed blood. They would take in the Opens, they would take in Vanier, they would take in anyone that had talent and prove themselves. So this is, they're barking up the wrong tree. Yeah, you can come on in, it's on that side. So they're totally barking up the wrong tree, so this is something, at every opportunity I have, I'll call it out, it's complete bullshit. And we can go bark somewhere else. Now, Viking music has been growing also, like crazy. So when I first started the slide way back in the day, I had like one band down, like one type of music, and the slide has just been growing and growing and growing as I just go down the Spotify rabbit hole. After listening to Fortuna or Amon Mars or something like that, I just let it go. I discovered a whole bunch of other bands. So if you guys are interested in this, so there's a lot more genres than just folk and metal now at this point. And there's a lot more bands than the ones I listed there. Those are some of my personal favorites that you can put on if you're running an RPG session or something like that. And I put that on like low in the background to kind of set the tone for you. And so now let's talk about Marvel. Everyone is very familiar with Norse mythology from Marvel comics and Marvel movies. So you know, I'm often asked, you know, can you tell us what they did right and what they did wrong? So we do have some videos on our YouTube channel where I go into this, but I'm also going to reiterate it here. So things that they got right. So that they did Odin correctly, he's missing an eye, he's the Allfather. Asgard is done correctly, Heimdall is done correctly. So there's a lot of things that they did correctly. However, there's certain glaring things that they basically did their own thing, and they didn't really follow the myths. So when we look at Thor, the most iconic character in the myths, he's depicted as being short, stocky, and with red hair. Which is not at all how he's depicted here. The hammer cannot return to him. He needs the gauntlets and the girdle to make that happen. He can't fly without his chariot and goats. That's another thing. And he is not the adopted brother of Loki, Thor at all. He's actually blood brothers with Odin. So he and Odin made a pact in battle that they would be blood brothers. And so he and Odin are much more like two peas in a pod. They have very similar characteristics. They're both very much anti-heroes. So by putting Thor and Loki, I think they're looking more for a juxtaposition of personalities. And then Loki, when we look at him, he's in the spell Jotun. So when we look at his parents, for Laufey and for Bauti, they have a lot of their traits are built on mirages and heat and fire and ash. And the two siblings that he has are Helblindi and Vilest. And those two guys also, their kennings are for things like ash and spark. And so he's much more towards being a Muspelio, which is fire giant, rather than riding giant. Then when you look at his wife, Sigyn, she's really not mentioned in a lot of sources. She was his Asgardian wife with two kids, Nari and Vali. And Mistress Angraboda is nowhere to be seen either. So for her, she was his mistress who they had 3 children with together, Hel, Jormungandr, and Finn. Those 3 are depicted, I think, Hel in Marvel is Thor and Loki's sister.
Older sister.
And yeah, and then I don't know what they did with Finn or Jormungandr. They didn't get a lot of screen time in Ragnarok. But, and it's been a long time since I read the comics, and I was in the comics in the 80s, so. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that you could definitely use a consultant. Actually, there was a really funny anecdote too. I was at Fan Expo Toronto, and Fan Expo Toronto, there's an older couple that comes by my booth, and they start flipping through the books, and they're hemming and hawing, and pointing stuff out, and looking at stuff, and other customers show up, buy stuff, or show up, don't buy stuff, and walk away. They're still there. It's been like 20 minutes there at the booth, and I'm like, can I answer some questions and anything? He's like, I'm working on a project for myself, my own indie project, and I want to do it with Norse mythology. It's clear you guys did a lot of research here. I'd love to, utilize this as research material, but you also have your own Fate of the Norns universe stuff in there. And I don't want to accidentally rip you guys off for copyright and IP infringement and anything like that. I said, well, I'd rather you rip me off than you rip off Marvel, because that's you're totally up to lunch with Marvel.
Well, then again, Marvel, they started writing Thor comics in the 1960s,
Yeah.
and how much of this was accessible to the general public in the 1960s?
Well, outside
Outside of very specialized,
So the funny thing is I ended up shitting all over it for a good 10 minutes.
Mhm.
And I go, so what do you do? He goes, I'm a comic book artist. And he looks down at his badge and it's backwards, upside down. And he flips it over. And I'm like, oh no. And he has this big grin on his face because he's like, gotcha. He was, and his name's on the tip of my tongue. He did Thor throughout all the 80s. He created every villain. Someone have his name? I forget his name right now. Shoot, but it was so funny. So we ended up laughing about it, ended up getting the books. We took photos together. But that was my funny Marvel story when I met him. So what do I do? What do we do as Pendleton? So I'm an author. I'm a game designer. We started out with Fate of the Norns Ragnarok back in 1992-93. This was pretty much a passion project. We were playing D&D 2nd edition. Our house rules were growing thicker and thicker and thicker until they were fatter than the player's handbook. And then we said, why the hell are we playing this? We should make our own RPG. And so using Deities and Demigods, we're kind of flipping through to inspire ourselves about what kind of world we want to have, because we're all history buffs and mythology buffs, and we just landed on Norse mythology. And so we ended up creating this back in 93. 2006, we stripped out the percentile dice and put in runes. The Elder Futhark runes are actually used in the RPG. That allowed us to revolutionize the RPG space significantly that the dice did not allow us to do. So the first thing it allowed us to do is create the world's first RPG that has 3 levels of mechanical crunch or complexity, and anyone at the table could play at any level at any time, and the system ties them together in real time. So myself, I'm older than dirt. I've been RPGing since like the original D&D, and I can tell you everyone at the table has always got a different tolerance for math and rules complexity. So if someone says, hey, let's play Shadowrun or Rollmaster, if someone else is there, I want to play Fate, I want to play a story-based game, I want to go on an adventure, I don't want to be going through charts and tables, where someone else is like, I want to see numbers popping up, and me stacking powers and things like that. So with the 3 levels of crunch, any player can play at any level, and the system will allow them to coexist with everyone else around the table. And it's also a tool for the GM, because how many here play RPGs? Pretty much almost everybody. So when you have to run a boss monster and a whole bunch of minions, most RPGs are going to have you look at everything at the same level of minutia. Whereas here we could say, oh, the boss monster's got really cool powers, we'll run him on high level crunch. But I can run minions on the lowest level of crunch, and they'll pretty much be running on autopilot. And that frees up your mental cycles for the stuff that matters. The other thing is damage really matters in Fate of the Norns Ragnarok because of the runes. When we take a look at hit point systems, take a quick survey. Who thinks hit point systems make combat feel more risky and dangerous? Nobody, actually. We're all on the same page in agreement there. Because, if you've got a GM that's kind of setting this tone, you're heading down into the crypt of the Lich King, there's a fog that's hanging over the land, you see skeletal hands ripping out of the ground, and an Eldritch Bolt is fired at you. How much damage did we get? We were 13 damage, 50. Why am I doing this math? There's no effect until it hits 0. And if there is effects, it's all cumbersome lookup tables and things like that. Whereas in the runic system, you've got your symbols that are tied to all of your spells, abilities, talents, and skills. And when you take a wound, you just take a rune out of your bag and put it aside. Until you're healed, you cannot draw that rune. So every single hit just immediately has an impact on your character, and your abilities start going down. Without any lookup tables, no heavy math, and the game just flows. That's pretty much what we were aiming to do with our RPG. It's like the spotlight's on the action, stays on the action, you never spin your wheels in the mud. The other thing that we got inspired to do was create a whole bunch of graphic novels. And so the first one is Eyrbyggja Saga. It's my personal favorite from the Icelandic bodies of work. The best way to describe this saga is if it were written by the Coen brothers and directed by Robert Rodriguez. It starts out like super low key. It's just a whole bunch of people coming to Iceland, trying to settle where the land's going to be between that rock and that fjord, and then they start fighting over what washed up on the beach. So it's like just a huge hillbilly fight in terms of for resources and space. And then just out of nowhere, you flip a page and it's just blood rain starts coming down, and there's witches and Draugr and all kinds of stuff. So it's like from dusk till dawn kind of vibe to it. The first half of the movie's got a certain feel, and the second half of the movie just goes off the rails. So that's Eyrbyggja Saga for you. And then we have a much more serious one, which is the Saga of Firewolf. And that one deals with Egil Saga. So remember I mentioned there's 2 really big sagas from the Icelandic bodies of work, Njal Saga and Egil Saga. both very long. So we took one of the chapters from Egil Saga, and we inserted some of our major characters. You can picture like Elminster or Drizzt or things like that. Our main characters intersecting with the saga. That is what that graphic novel is for that chapter of the story. So those are our two Icelandic sagas, and then the Illuminated Edda. So this was 3.5 years of my life. I translated Old Norse into modern English, and I wrote it in prose that flows because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I own a lot of these academic translations. I probably own 15 or 16 prose translations, various professors. And when my friends come to my house and they're like, "Hey Andrew, can I like borrow one of your eddas so I can read about the Norse myths and I want to understand them like as they were without any, dilution or change and whatnot?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely. Grab one of the books." Next day they're coming back and I can't read this. You cured my son. Right? It's a very dry academic English. So unless you're really, really into it, it's going to put you to sleep. So this is the reason I ended up reading the Illuminated Edda. It's the actual translations, but it was 2 years of translation, 1.5 years of rewriting it into that modern English that flows. Because that's, when you read it in Old Norse, it has that flow, it has that rhyme, it has that, that poetic beauty to it. So I'm not a poet, I couldn't get it to that level, but I tried to get it to a novel style. I also tried to put everything in chronological order in the book. You've got the creation myths, you've got Ragnarok at the end. I also did a bonus translation of the Saga of Friedrich the Wise that no one had translated since Tolkien back in forever ago. And it's a phenomenal tale. And then I brought in some bonus materials. So I have stories from the Just of the Norn, which I was mentioning was very, very interesting. For example, I'll give you one quick example that really floored me when I read it. So if you guys are familiar with a little bit about the characters, does everyone know who Loki and Heimdall are? Heimdall is the guardian of the Asgard, the Bifrost Bridge, and he loathes Loki. And Loki is the trickster god, and we don't really have a context in terms of why they hate each other. And if we go any further than that, we've got the battle between Hod, the blind god, and Balder. So Loki uses Hod to fashion a mystical spear, throws it at Balder, who's immune to everything except mistletoe, and Balder dies. And so now Hod and Loki are on the hook for this murder. And again, no context in terms of what is there bad blood between Hod and Balder. Just the Norn goes right into this. So when we look at Balder, he had a wife named Nanna, and in the Norse material, they never mentioned the nature of Nanna. Is she a giantess? Is she an Aesir goddess, a Vanir goddess? But in the Just Norn, they mentioned she's an immortal woman, and she had no interest in Balder. And Balder kept coming after her, he courted her, and then he was just it didn't matter. And so Hod stepped in and said, nope. She said, no, leave her alone. And so they had a series of battles. And they don't mention Balder blinding Hod in these battles, but Hod wins some battles, Balder wins some battles, and by the end, Balder's victorious over the war between them. And I'm assuming that he got blinded. And so a lot of these additional sources make it to read that much more interesting in Illuminated Edda because you get that extra context that is missing when you look at just some of the Norse sources. Then I've got the creation myths from the Celtic and Finnish myths because it's really interesting to see their creation myths juxtaposed with those of their neighbors, right? So we were talking about them being raiders and traders earlier, exchanging ideas with those that they interacted with. So by seeing these, I interspersed those chapters right next to whichever chapter we had from the Eddas, so you can actually have that comparison between the two and see the similarities and the differences in the cultures. And then I added some fairy tales from the Mabinogion, Baltic, and Inuit, because that was also a nice intercept. So again, 3.5 years of my life, crazy, but it's done. And so now we jump to Q&A. How long was that? Yeah, right on time, 45 minutes. Go ahead.
Can you please pronounce your last name?
Valkauskas.
Valkauskas.
Yeah.
Norwegian?
No, Lithuanian.
Lithuanian.
Yeah, so that's right on the Baltic Sea.
Oh.
So I'm sure, yeah, there was some raping and pillaging in my ancestry. I've got some blood running through.
The amber.
The amber, yes.
Yeah, that's where
There's a lot of amber in the Baltic Sea.
Yeah. And the Vikings traded that all over.
That's right. Yeah, good stuff. Good. More questions? We got time.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Okay. So in your early slides of pop culture, you forgot the Northmen.
Oh yes, the
The
Northman, the movie,
movie.
yes. That was very good. It was very well researched. I really, really enjoyed it. Even the tattoos on the Valkyrie's teeth were right on spot. Because a lot of people come to ask me, they're like, what was wrong with her teeth? Was she wearing dentures? Were they wearing teeth? I'm like, no, that's tattooing. That was a practice that they did then.
I remember when that came out, people were like, oh, she has braces or something?
Yeah, no, it's runes.
I thought they handled the Drogar pretty well. too.
Yeah, very well, very well. My only beef, like if I really have to nitpick at this point, is like their final battle is in the volcano, and they're saying it's, you know, the gates to Niflheim. And Niflheim is the realm of the dead and cold. It's absolute cold and ice. So when you look at like the creation myths, there was Ginnungagap, which is nothingness, the void. And there were two primordial realms that were floating in the void, Muspelheim and Niflheim, realm of ice and fire. And they crashed into each other. And from the steam came the world tree Yggdrasil and all of the other worlds that hung upon its branches and roots. And so that would be my like, one little gripe. And then my other one was the revenge story's been done to death. So yeah. Yeah.
They folded in Bill Shakespeare.
Yeah.
With the drum.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
So I've heard that Snorri sometimes tweaks the myths because he wanted to make a logically coherent system out of what was an oral tradition that contradicted itself a lot. Is that something that, is that an accurate characterization?
He was definitely trying to make heads or tails of it, just like I tried to do with like Illuminated, and I tried to make it chronological if I can. I had like 2 or 3 poems that were in duplicate because they're in the Poetic Edda. And I had to choose which ones are going to be canon in my book,
Right.
and which ones I'm going to translate and put in the appendix, just for completion's sake. And so, like anything in antiquity, it's going to be messy. There's going to be omissions, there's going to be contradictions. So yeah, I'm sure that was his effort, was the definitive book on Norse mythology.
And there was Christian bias too, or also the Judeo-Christian looking, our way of life versus how they interpret their own way of life.
Yeah, if you look at Christianity in Iceland, at that point it had been at least 100 years, right? And in the mainland even longer. So there's definitely going to be biases, but I can tell you that his writings were very, very much unbiased compared to like the Justin Horn that had a lot more editorialized stuff. He got it out of the way in the first chapter, in the prose edit. He just basically says, they're heroes from Troy, don't kill me. And then he launches into it afterwards. And so there's no more disclaimers throughout the rest of his book, which is really good. Because it'd be really bad if you just like every 5 minutes you feel like another, oh, but this guy, yeah. So he also tried to bring in more data than just the poems from the Poetic Edda. So when I was talking about the Saga of Hedric the Wise that I translated, there's a sword called Tirfing in the saga. So there's a great berserker named Agantir. And so Agantir is the grandfather of the main character in the saga. And he was a great berserker and basically had the sword that anytime it came out of the scabbard, it had to drink blood. It had to kill somebody. Like that was its curse, right? Before it could be resheathed, someone was going to die in the war. And so the granddaughter comes to this tomb and wants the sword. And she demands it from him as her rightful inheritance. And then she has 3 sons, responsible kid 1, responsible kid 2, and the black sheep, irresponsible kid 3, and gives the sword to him.
Well, that's brilliant. I blame the parents.
Of course. And so, so the mention of the sword, the mention of her and her grandfather, those are in the prose as well. So what Snorri was trying to do was to get as much of the information that he had and put it into one piece of work. And rather than retell the whole tale, he leaves that up to whoever is reading this to go research it. Or probably at the time there was still that oral tradition, so you'd find someone that'd be able to tell you the story. But he was just trying to jot down the bullet points of each one of these tales. More questions?
So, can it be reasonable to say that, like, kind of the current interest in, Viking era beyond, the Scandinavia itself and broader pop culture is something that came out very much in kind of the 19th century with the Viking movement and things like Wagner, that they really revived kind of the broader interest in Western culture in this time period?
Yeah, so in the 19th century, there was a huge revival movement all across all of Europe for all things fairy tale. That's when you had like Arthur Rackham art that is like synonymous with that period. You had Padraig Colum, which wrote a whole bunch of fairy tale books from different traditions. You also had Lang, that also had his series of fairy tale books that came out in that period. So there are definitely, that's where you end up getting the feathers in the helmet and the horn helmets. That's from the Wagnerian opera, because they needed props that looked impressive. So that's what kind of lived on. That's one of the things that people flip through our pictures, like, hey, there's no horns on any of the helmets. So yeah, that movement right there, and we're going to talk about this on Saturday, the Celtic one, because I talk about King Arthur, and King Arthur was probably the biggest poster child for what you're talking about, is that whole romanticized movement. So he was a character that was in 300, 400 AD in Wales as a champion of the people. He was used as a poster boy of Celtic, Welsh culture. And then, getting the coffee, names are not coming to me today. If anyone can help me, the author in France who ended up creating the whole... Mallory, that's right. Ended up creating all of the romanticized stories that we all know today. So all of the stuff before Mallory is like hidden away, and that's why it's interesting to have these panels, because we can peel away a lot of the pop culture changes that have happened, and we can start talking about some of the original sources. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. More questions? Go ahead.
How has been, I guess, untangling the old Druidic culture and Viking culture? Because I've noticed a lot of overlap.
There is a lot of overlap. Yeah, so the Druids were not exclusively to the Celts, and Celtic is such a lazy term as well.
Yeah.
It's like saying European. That's how lazy Celtic is. That's not one belief system, it's a whole freaking continent's belief system, right? They all kind of lump together. But, sorry, what was the question?
It's just like untangling the two different myths together.
Oh yeah, so the Druids, yeah.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of sources in terms of how the Druids used different types of wood in Scandinavia, and the magic was known as Vervanwood. And so every single type of wood had its own magical properties, and that is how they ended up studying. That was the Druidic craft for Scandinavia. And when you look at the British Isles, when you look at Ireland, you look at Brittany in northern France, the Druids there had a completely different tradition. They were more about astrology, they were more about poetry, they were more about war tactics, and sacrifices to the gods. So like the MO was very different from medicine man to someone who was a pillar of society. And that was one of the reasons why when the Romans came, if you read a lot of the stuff by Tacitus and the Romans when they were doing the incursions into the Gaulish lands, all the way up to Hadrian's Wall, there was a lot of editorialized, writings about the Druids. They were trying to discredit them, trying to drag their reputation to the mud with the weaker men stories. So all of that was basically there to kind of just change the hearts and minds of the people that they ended up colonizing.
So every time I've seen, like something from the Eddas or read, any of these translations, I get a sense for the mythology, but as far as like how that translated into actual practice among, and I'm sure it was different among the elites versus the common Norwegian or Dane.
Right.
As far as their like day-to-day religious life, such that you can call it religion, what sources do we know about historical practice rather than reconstructions?
So if you read the sagas, so the Icelandic sagas, the Norse, Danish, you have a job called the Gothi. And the Gothi was kind of like your priest class among the people, the law speakers and the priest class. And they would be the ones that would end up doing the consecrations at different solstices. So you would see that there would be sacrifices of animals, the sprinkling of their blood, and everyone attended by certain sacred branches. There would be certain types of feasts that would be held. They'd talk about the afterlife and how they would send the dead off, depending on their status. So some of them would get ship burials, some of them would get cairn burials, some of them would be just buried. But the afterlife was very sacred. So I would point you towards the sagas if you want to see more of that belief system in action. Same thing with runes, right? So another question that comes up very often is like, do the runes have magical properties, or are they just an alphabet? And we know that they have magical properties because in Egilsaga, for example, we've got a feast where he's invited, and the chieftain there, he's causing so much trouble because he's a really obnoxious berserker, Egil, and they want to get him kicked out and whatever. Eventually, they lose patience and they poison a cup of mead and give it to him. And he suspects foul play, and he scribes a rune with his thumb on the drinking horn, and the drinking horn shatters, basically indicating that the liquid inside is poison. So yeah, there's a lot of that belief system and supernatural that's throughout the sagas. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned the stories between Pod and Boulder, and the versions I usually hear of Pod is like tricked into killing Boulder, I think. But what you mentioned with the fight between them,
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, if there was like a specific cultural context as to why there would be like those two different stories.
Well, there's nothing that said really tricked in the texts, right? So it's Loki whispers in Hod's ear, and Hod throws the spear, is in the Vulcan side. So we assume that he was tricked. But then when you end up reading more sources and you start getting this context, you start reading, okay, there's bad blood between these two. And so why would Loki choose anyone else? You would pick the guy that hates Vulcan, right? So that totally made sense. Where some other things might not make sense. So there are some other inter stories that were a little bit maybe out of character for some of the gods, but for this one I would say was spot on. Exactly what we needed to kind of fill that gap as to why these were the three principal actors in this account. Yeah.
So you mentioned specifically like a movie song.
The edit slide?
Yeah, so, well, the one you had.
Oh.
Well, did you mention that? Yeah, you mentioned that you also include some material regarding finishing the Baltic anyway, for example. I'm wondering if any of that work or any of your other work has touched at all on the Sami people.
So,
probably missed it also.
yeah, the Sami people are the northern part of Scandinavia, so Finland, Sweden, and Norway. That whole region there is the Sami peoples. So we touch upon it in Denizens of the North. It's one of our books, one of our expansion books. And we're going to be hitting all these cultures eventually. So we started with Norse mythology, then we ended up going into Celtic. So now if you go past by our booth, do we have a booth number?
No, it's just as you enter the room, you look to the left, it'll be right there.
We're by the doors.
We're right next to the door.
So we've got into Celtic. So what we ended up doing for the Illuminated Edda, I hired two guys to do a Celtic encyclopedia. So my knowledge of Celtic mythology is pretty good, but when we're producing literature, I really want like the best of the best doing it. So Mathieu and Tyler, Mathieu lives in Brittany. His whole family has been brought up in that whole tradition. Tyler has done extensive research work on this subject, and every time I was on call with these guys, all they could hear is my mechanical keyboard going off and was Googling stuff. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. So I learned a lot working with these guys on the Celtic Encyclopedia, and then we created the RPG for it, which is the Children of Ariu. So we've done Norse, Celtic, and then we were going to go into Baltic and Slavic next. We were going to do North American, that's on my list as well. But in 2022, 2023, we did a bunch of conventions on the circuit, and as people come by our booth, and oh, history, mythology, awesome. Where's Japanese? Like I kept hearing this. And I'm just going like, where's this coming from? Like, you get the 1 off, 2 off, 3 off, but when you're like, there's like 40 people that are asked us to the Japanese, what's
There's
going
no
on?
contact between the Nords and the Japanese. Like they sailed
But they
long
want to know it, right?
distances.
Yeah, but feudal Japanese and Shinto gods and stuff, that's cool stuff too.
It is, and we would do it around the Viking age, right?
Yes.
Our goal would have been around 9th, 10th century in Japan, which is not the period most people do for Japan,
Yeah.
right? It's always the Edo period, much later, right? And I asked them, I go like, what's the fascination? Why are you guys asking us for Japanese? And they're like, well, it was the pandemic, we were watching a lot of anime on Netflix, and then after we watched the anime, we picked up the mangas, and then from the mangas, we went into Japanese fairy tales, and we fell in love. And so when are you guys coming out with the books? So this was kind of like maybe number 12 or 14 on my to-do list of all the mythologies that we're going to be tackling before we die. And now it's bumped up to maybe number 3. But I mean, with the fact that we had, a little professor from Mexico telling us they made it to Mexico, is it a stretch that they made it to Japan?
Exactly. I was, actually,
Is
as
it a
you were
stretch?
saying that, I was just thinking, couldn't a Japanese, in 879, a Japanese guy and this Nordic guy
Meet in the Middle East.
had a beer together somewhere,
Yeah,
and they traded a weapon, they traded a piece of armor or something,
absolutely.
and because even
You
that's
see
school of thought.
You see that sort of thing a lot. So like in Bulgaria, they dug up the grave of this, of someone, they're not sure whether he was Bulgarian or Byzantine, but he had a jade sword slide on on the scabbard that had obviously been made in China and made its way all the way across. And,
Well, we got the Silk Road, right? That was a
Yeah.
huge trading
Yeah.
route.
Yeah.
It was nothing to stop that kind of
Japan
stuff that moved back.
was culturally linked with China for their entire history, basically.
Right,
So, it's not outside the realms of possibility.
definitely.
So
I
the
mean,
red-
wasn't there a drone that they sent to Mars called Viking drone? See, they even went out of the planets, come on.
The red-haired guy on the mural in Mexico, when
Yeah.
was that mural made?
I don't
Aztec
know.
times?
I didn't really go
Aztec
into it
times?
afterwards. This is one of my funny anecdotes of just
Okay.
meeting someone that told me something. I didn't really go down that because I love Mesoamerican. That was in my top 5 to release. I know it just as well as Norse mythology, and so I can't wait to do a Mesoamerican RPG and a whole mythology book and everything to go along with it. That's one of the things.
Do you go into like the cultural blending out of Great Novgorod and Kiev with this Norse influencing the Slavic, back and forth, Norse influencing the Slavic, Slavic influencing the Norse, and how that culture evolves from 2 strains into one completely different one?
We touch upon it in our book Denizens of the North. So what happens is we have the core rule book, and then that gives us like a 30,000-foot overview of everything.
Mhm.
And then the next big book that we released was Denizens of the North, which is a deep dive into Midgard, the realm of mankind. So we go into all the kingdoms, the kings, the wars, and the cultures and languages and all that in that book. And then the next book is Lords of the Ash, which are the outer worlds. So because the ash tree, Yggdrasil. So you've got Asgard, Vanguard, Jotunheim, Muspelheim, Svartalfheim, Nidavellir, and Niflheim. So all of those are handled in that book. And so, but to your question, like you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of these relationships and the lineages and things like that. That's going to be in our Baltic and Slavic RPG and I guess mythology book when we get to it. When we head east.
Yeah, and then you can go a little further south and get into the Mediterranean, where you have
That's already started.
Kievan Rus in the Varangian Guard
Yep.
fighting Norsemen who have learned how to speak French and become Norman, and they're fighting each other in Albania, what is today Albania.
Yeah. We have a prequel setting in the works right now. So there's someone that really knows the Roman Empire and the Germanic tribes in
Yeah.
15 AD, like the Battle of Judenburg Forest, the big decisive battle that basically swung the tide against the Roman Empire in that region. So this is going to be our prequel setting that is in the works right now. It's not our next Kickstarter, it's the Kickstarter after that. And so that one is going to be, everything to do with the Mediterranean and north. From there onwards. So it's going to be very interesting, and the fact that we changed the timeline too to something that's much earlier is going to be very, very interesting for our fans.
I found it interesting that you mentioned all the Norwegian and Swedish kings, they're all claiming descent from Odin.
Yep.
And
Or Frey.
okay.
Yeah. Frey.
Because I know that like the Saxons, the Franks, the Burgundians, all before they converted to Christianity, their kings claimed the same thing.
Well, for sure.
And it was like, unless you're from a family that claims, descent from Odin, you can't really call yourself a king. You might be a great leader, but you're not really a king. Because Odin's the father of kings.
Well, you need some sort of relationship with the supernatural, right?
Yes.
Or the higher powers. And so when you look at Celtic myths, again, we'll talk about this on Saturday, a lot of the authority to rule became from kings marrying the land spirit. So the woman that was the embodiment, the physical manifestation of that land spirit. So by marrying her, you now have claims to this land and governing this land, things like that, yeah.
That makes sense and plays very much into the whole king is the land. It's kind of, you know,
Yeah, that's where we
later
end up getting into
romantic.
romanticized
Yeah.
King Arthur stories, yeah.
Do these either somehow come up with some sort of good genealogy where it was like descended from this or something like that?
I would
Most
not
of
be
them did.
surprised.
Most of them did, yeah. They
Not
had
be
all kinds of
surprised.
claims. Come on, check Ancestry.com. I swear. Go ahead.
Just fairy tales of the Inuit.
Yeah,
Can you give a 30-second elevator speech on that?
yeah, absolutely. So there is a water spirit that I wanted to talk about. The names are just not coming to me this morning. I needed a coffee before I
It's okay.
started this. But she is Nerevik, and so she basically went out fishing with her father. She ended up falling overboard and died in the sea and became the goddess of the sea. Now the thing with the Inuit is very interesting. The way they look at their gods or spirits, land spirits, it's not out of like reverence and we want you closer in our lives and things like that. It's more, we want to give you offerings so you leave us alone and stay the hell out of our way. That is a relationship with the higher powers, because if you think about it, it's a very dangerous place to live, right? So if you don't respect the water, you don't respect the cold wind, you don't respect the polar bears, you will die, right? So
I mean, yeah.
yeah, so in this case, it's very interesting to see how she juxtaposed with the sea gods of the Norse. And this is why I put her in there, because her alongside Njord, which is a Vanir god of the sea, and Aegir. So it's really interesting to see Nerevik side by side by them in terms of how they're approached by their own court and by humanity as a whole. More questions?
I have a question online.
Yeah.
So, do we know if it's true that the first adventurer to find North America, Canada, was Viking, aka Leif Erikson?
That is the standing fact right now. We haven't found any other contradictions to that. So Leif is pretty much given the credits for finding the New World first. But we have no idea who was there and lost the Meadow and found the founding of Vinland. Vinland is still very much up in the air in terms of people are saying it's the land of grapes, right? So right now, by modern sensibilities or modern weather, we end up looking at where do grapes naturally grow in the wilds. And right now, I think it's Massachusetts was the closest place where they will grow naturally without being curated by mankind to make sure that they don't die during winter. So they're assuming that Vinland could be as far down south as Massachusetts is where they went.
Yeah, what was the
travels.
climate 1,100 years
Exactly.
ago?
That's the whole point, is we have no idea. We'd have to go through ice cores and things like that. And I don't think anyone in this mythological space has partnered up with scientists to try and get further into answering that question. That was a great question, thank you.
Thank you. Another question is, let me just get this here. What are your thoughts on Vikings in video game cultures?
So we had a slide about that earlier on. I can swoon back to that slide. It was right at the beginning. So I have a few games that I mentioned right at the beginning, if you weren't there. So Senua's Sacrifice was one of them that was very well told. Then we have God of War, which we have a video on YouTube where I talk about things like Frey and Frigga and Freya.
Not out yet.
It's not it?
Not out yet.
It's not out yet?
Yeah, we didn't post it yet.
Okay, so there will be a video where we talk about, but we've talked about it already in the
Spoilers.
recording. Spoiler, you got a spoiler here. Freya, they put Freya and Frigga as the same character, which is totally not the case. There are more than enough sources that mention that both of them are two separate characters. And then what else can I? Banner Saga, aces all around, fantastic video game. There was Assassin's Creed Valhalla, right?
Yeah.
That one I didn't play. I'm not much for like 3D adventure platformers unless it's Uncharted. I'll take a look at some playthroughs and we'll doing some videos right now on our YouTube channel. We're doing recordings, so they're going to be dropping soon. And we'll be talking about things like those games as well, the pros and cons. If there's any other games that you have specifically on your mind, shout them out. And if I've played them, I can chime in on them. But yeah, the two that I really adore, the bookends right here, Runner Saga and Single Sacrifice, phenomenal games.
You mentioned Frigga and Freya being combined sometimes. Do you interpret Golbeg as Freya?
Nope, not at all. She's a completely different character. So when you look at the Aesir Vanir War, am I wearing my Golbeg shirt? I am. Golbeg was the Vanir's secret weapon. She was the nuke that they sent. So there was a huge battle between the Aesir and Vanir. So for those of you that were not online at the time, we'll just rewind a little bit. So there's the proto Norse gods, which were the Vanir. So you're talking about Frey, Njord, Aegir, Golbeg. And then you've got the Norse gods that we know today. So the Aesir gods, which are like Tyr, Thor, Odin, Heimdall, etc. So they had a war. There was a period where the two families fought. And they were fighting at a standstill, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then what ended up happening was Golbeg was sent out into Asgard as their secret weapon. And when Golbeg walked into Asgard, and at that time Asgard did not have its walls. The walls of Asgard were built afterwards. When she went in there, anyone that laid eyes on her, their hearts were just completely filled with greed and avarice and jealousy. And just by her being in Asgard, all the Asgardians basically turned on each other. And there was almost a civil war. And so Odin saw this, and they're like, she's tearing us apart. We're done for. She lives. So he ended up throwing a spear at her through the heart, and she dropped, and she rose. And he threw a spear again. And of course, like any good fairy tale or myth, she has to do it 3 times. So 3 spears through her heart, she finally drops. And he's like, I'm not taking any chances with Golbeg. We're going to burn her. So they burn her to bits. And who wanders up to the burial pit or the burn pit afterwards? No one other than Loki. Loki sifts through the ashes, finds her heart, and eats it. And you can imagine some of the more scandalous things start happening. Loki starts doing some more evil deeds afterwards.
Isn't there a belief though that she existed beyond that and came back like 3 different times? Yeah, that's what maybe I'm misinterpreting.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Tell me. Like I don't know everything,
yeah.
right? So.
But I thought what part of their agreement when the Vanir and the Aesir had their second kind of aggression that she was set they had to banish her.
Well, they banished her right off the bat. So the Vanir did not want to live with her, right? Because she was just a weapon that would go off against anybody, right? So they sent her off into exile. And basically, as this war is just fighting and fighting, they're like, Golbeg, we need you. Whatever your terms are, we need you. Come and like, save our butts here.
But when I forget when they exchanged hostages, I forget the name, I'm having brain fog.
So there's
But
3.
they cut off the head of one and the other.
Yeah, Ymir. So.
Yeah, so,
Is it Ymir? Yeah, I should have. I think it's
yeah, it is.
Yeah, his head. Yeah, his head gets sent
more
back.
like-
Yeah, so basically they chop off his head and they make it an oracle.
Yeah.
Right? He puts sacred herbs in Ymir's
But didn't that
skull.
action cause a second type of skirmish between?
No, there was no second skirmish, but just the Vanir did not look at the Aesir in the same light because they're like, listen, we sent our best, you sent your best, but what did you do with our best? You like freaking massacred one of them, you killed another one, you sent back the 3rd one, I think. So yeah, they just didn't think highly of the Aesir afterwards because it was supposed to be an exchange of hostages where they send their best to each other. And yeah, who the Aesir sent were not their best. But the ones that were sent from the Vanir were Freya, and Njord, which were some of their best.
So I just bought the illuminated edit from you.
Oh, did you?
A couple weeks ago.
Okay.
So I just started digesting it. Do you go in talking about the Weir and the Nornir and like I've heard interpretations where it's actually a wooden plank or it's a tapestry or whatever it is. Where is this? Is it in the place where none of the gods of Job can go?
Yeah,
Or is
they
it
can't
the
go there.
tapestry of the universe? I mean,
No, there's these realms, these ascending heavens
Yeah.
in the Norse pantheon, and the gods cannot go in this ascending heaven. Only the Norns can traverse these realms.
Isn't that like a womb in Yggdrasil?
It could be. I mean, there's many different types of interpretations, many different types, because there isn't enough information about the Norns.
Yeah.
And so if you notice in my illuminated edda, I have 2 types of borders on my chapters, right? So I've got the chapters where they're the direct translations, and I've got chapters which are basically my explanations of things based on my understandings,
Yeah.
and I keep them separate with those borders, so like you never confuse. Like if someone says, I don't want to read anything from your brain, I just want to read what's direct. They can just skip through my chapters and go straight to those. But those chapters I find add a lot of richness because there's a lot of things that people did not know about and not think about, certain story arcs and things like that, and that's why I put those few chapters inside throughout the
I noticed you go right from Mosselstein and Niflheim in Gungagap, and I probably pronounced it wrong.
Gungagap,
I
yeah.
know just enough to get in trouble. All of a sudden, the Mosselstein and Jotun are running around. You don't even mention the ox and stuff like that.
There's a lot. I mean, that book originally was 800 pages,
Yeah.
and I had to do some cuts
Sure.
because there's no way we're like bringing 800-page books to conventions and even just shipping something like that. It's super expensive. So some things had to be cut. It's not everything that's in there in the original manuscript, and I do have a part 2 planned.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, for the so I still have a whole bunch of stuff that's
Yggdrasil,
cut.
do you pronounce it Yggdrasil? or
Yggdrasil.
Yggdrasil?
Yeah.
Okay, so it formed from the melting ice and stuff. Did it start off as a sapperling and suddenly later it's holding the 9 worlds? I mean, is there a growth thing? Is there
It
anything?
never goes into it in the poems.
Okay.
It never goes into it. So it's left to your interpretation
Okay.
of the sequence of events from it growing out of the steam to how the worlds appear.
Yeah, because Odin and his 2 brothers, depending on your interpretations or who you read,
Yeah.
went around slaying giants and then obviously making the earth, or, sorry.
Yeah, Ymir. So
Yeah,
they
yeah.
slay the proto giant
Yeah.
Ymir, and
Yeah.
from his body then
Yeah, so
Midgard.
like, is there something lost between tales, where, Yggdrasil is growing and
Well, that's the whole
Yeah, yeah.
scale here. Where when we look at the tales being told, they were originally told to teach a lesson, right? If you look at fairy tales, you look at mythology, it's all about imparting lessons upon people because there were no schools, there was no internet. How do kids learn what to do, what not to do, right? So it was through very flowery tales and things like that. Now, how do you go from flowery tales that are there to teach stories and educate the young to now I need a complete RPG world and all the answers are answered? There's a big gap there, a really big gap. And so we try to do that in our RPGs is to fill in all of those gaps with our IP, right? So the stuff that we put in there that will flesh it all out. Because as a GM, you can't just take the mythology sources and go, I'm running with this, because there's going to be way too many contradictions and omissions. Your players can go, this doesn't make sense. Yeah, and you need stats here. Exactly. So we did the heavy lifting.
from the mythos, how do you handle Hel or Hela? I mean, there's a Judeo-Christian belief system where, she's evil, she's the land of the dead and stuff. I mean, Odin literally gave her power over the dead, correct?
So he exiled her from Asgard because the Volvas. So he was obsessed with the future. Odin, that's one of his characteristics, is he definitely wanted to know anything that was going to happen, especially if it was going to be to do with Ragnarok and his demise. And so he ended up finding out that whatever realm she's in, she will be the queen of that realm. So he had to send her out of Asgard. So just like he threw out Jormungandr, he threw out Hel, and they chained up Fenrir. And so when she got thrown out, my interpretation is Niflheim is the realm of the dead. So he killed her to send her there. And then she appeared there as a kid. And then as a kid, she grew into her position of forging the kingdom of Helheim and being the queen, the undisputed queen of the dead.
So you interpret her as having the powers, born with those powers?
Born with those powers because she was born
Sure.
with a half skeletal face already. They were sent already in the poems. They were going that all of the Aesir were aghast and frightened by the appearance of Angrboda's children. Yeah, so she was definitely not pleasant to look at.
Now, was she a Niflheim giant? Or you
Nope. She would be half, right? So if you look at the genealogy of Loki, he would be a fire giant.
But his was.
And then if you look at Angrboda, Angrboda is the witch that lives in Jarnvid, the Ironwood, and that is in Jotunheim. So she could be an ice giantess.
Okay.
So their children would be fire and ice descent, right? All three children. More questions? Yeah.
With I just thought of this, with you mentioning that there would be a fire and ice descent, Do you think there might be something to that's why those children ended up so strange?
Yeah, most likely, yeah. These are not two elements that should be mixing and producing things that work.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Symbols and half-dead children.
Yeah, absolutely. That was very cool. It's too bad that Marvel didn't give them more screen time.
Yeah.
They were just there for like a flash and then they were gone.
Fenrir gets killed by Hulk.
By Hulk.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
He gets punched and unfortunately.
Well, that happened, right?
Yeah, if we did mention Hulk, chapter 3,
One of my favorite stories. I wonder if they would interpret him as a good.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, didn't that happen in Hulk Saga?
Yeah.
It's the Banner Saga, right? Bruce Banner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go.
Good one. Any more? Any more online?
No.
All right, well then thanks for everyone for coming out.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very much.
Goodbye, stream.
Very cool.